Marcus moved quickly, his eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of movement. He could feel the alien woman's breath on his neck, her footsteps echoing behind him. He glanced back for a moment, catching sight of her face, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. He had no idea who she was. But that didn't matter right now. All that mattered was getting her out of this alive. They were running out of time. Every second counted. The sound of gunfire was deafening around them, but Marcus pushed forward, keeping his focus sharp. He ducked under a fallen beam and heard the woman's strained breathing as she stumbled behind him. He didn't have time to check if she was okay, but the limp in her step made his stomach tighten with worry. Still, they pressed on. Marcus led the way through the ruined streets, his mind racing with calculations. They needed to find cover, get to a safe spot, and figure out how to regroup with the rest of the squad. But the city was a labyrinth of twisted metal and rubble. Every turn felt like a new death trap. They were deep in enemy territory, and Marcus knew they couldn't stay out in the open for long. The ground beneath them trembled with the sound of distant explosions, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning flesh. He could see Sorathian soldiers moving through the streets ahead of them, and the woman gasped in horror, her hand tightening on his arm as she realized they were surrounded. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't keep running forever. They needed to fight, or they would be cut down where they stood. Without a word, he grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her into an alleyway hidden behind a collapsed building. He shoved her behind a piece of debris and took cover himself, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sounds of enemy soldiers getting closer, their boots hitting the ground with cold certainty. Marcus peered around the edge of the wreckage, scanning for an opening, a way out, but the Sorathians were closing in. He cursed under his breath. There was no way they could fight their way out of this without backup, and his squad was nowhere in sight. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, and yet he didn't hesitate as a new plan formed in his mind. They had to take out the lead soldiers, then find a way to retreat to a safer position. He looked over at the woman. She was crouched low behind the rubble, her eyes wide with fear. But there was a spark of something else there, something fierce. She wasn't just some helpless civilian. She was someone with strength. She had survived this long. Somehow he knew she wasn't going to cower in fear. She would fight if given the chance. And in that moment, Marcus realized that he wasn't just protecting her. He was going to need her to survive this too. The next few moments were a blur of calculated movements. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then motioned for the woman to follow his lead. They had to move fast, and they had to move smart. He counted to 3, and then leaped out of cover, gun blazing, taking down the first 2 soldiers with well-aimed shots. The rest scattered, but Marcus didn't stop. He kept pushing forward, dragging the woman along with him as they sprinted through the alleyway, deeper into the city, towards the last place he'd seen a potential escape route. The sounds of battle echoed behind them, but they couldn't look back, not now, not until they had made it out alive. Marcus and the woman pushed through the maze of ruined buildings, their footsteps echoing in the dead silence between the explosions. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and every time Marcus looked back, he could see the faint outline of enemy soldiers chasing them closer and closer. The weight of the woman's presence was a constant reminder of how high the stakes, but he couldn't afford to fail her. He couldn't afford to fail anyone, not again. They reached a junction where several alleyways met, and Marcus instinctively took the one leading into a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for both of them to squeeze through. The woman was breathing heavily, but she kept up her pace, even though her injuries were clearly slowing her down. Marcus could feel his own heart pounding, but he didn't show any signs of fatigue. They didn't have the luxury of slowing down, yet they pushed through the tight alley with Marcus leading the way, keeping his eyes constantly scanning for any movement. The woman stayed close behind him, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm, as if she was holding on to him for stability. He didn't mind. She had no reason to trust him, but she was trusting him anyway. And that was enough for now. They couldn't afford to think about what would happen if they got separated, or worse, the fact that the Sorathians were closing in fast reminded him that their window was closing. He glanced back at her for a moment and saw the sweat beading on her forehead, her face pale and her expression strained. But she kept moving. Her resilience was something he couldn't ignore. She was more than just an alien princess. She was a fighter. They turned another corner, and Marcus immediately held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He crouched down behind a pile of rubble, his eyes scanning the street ahead. They were getting closer to the edge of the city, and there was a makeshift bridge leading into the outskirts. He had hoped to make it there without drawing attention, but the sound of boots slamming against the ground told him that Sorethians had found their trail. He motioned for the woman to crouch low and stay silent for a moment. He focused on the sounds around him, the rhythmic beat of approaching soldiers. He could see their shadows moving on the other side of the alleyway, closing in fast. They were getting too close, and he had no choice but to act quickly. He reached for the grenade at his belt and without hesitation pulled the pin, tossing it into the middle of the street. Just as the soldiers turned the corner, the explosion was deafening, a burst of light and smoke engulfing the area. The Sorethians screamed. As they were thrown back by the blast, Marcus grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her toward the bridge without wasting another second. The explosion had bought them some time, but they couldn't afford to linger much longer. Marcus kept his focus sharp. Every step was calculated. They couldn't let their guard down, even for a moment. They made it to the bridge, and Marcus surveyed the area quickly. The sounds of battle still echoed in the distance, but they were closer to the outskirts of the city, where the resistance had set up a safe zone. They had to reach it, or they'd be stuck between two armies. With no way out, the woman stumbled slightly, but she steadied herself. Her strength was remarkable. Even in her condition, Marcus couldn't help but respect her determination. He pulled her along, and as they neared the edge of the bridge, he could see the first signs of movement in the distance. Sorethian reinforcements were coming up fast, and they were not far behind them. The countdown to escape was ticking down. The bridge loomed ahead, a dark and rusted structure that seemed barely able to hold the weight of a single person, much less the two of them. Marcus didn't have time to analyze it, though they had no choice but to cross it if they were going to survive. The Sorethian reinforcements were closing in fast, and the alley they had just run through was now swarming with their soldiers. Marcus turned to the woman, grabbing her by the arm and urging her to move faster. They were running out of time. Every second mattered. He could already hear the faint echo of enemy footsteps coming from behind the bridge would offer them temporary cover, but it was a risky move, even more so when Marcus saw how unstable it looked. The rusted metal creaked beneath his boots with every step, but there was no turning back. The woman struggled to keep up her breath, shallow and strained, but her grip on his arm never loosened. Even when she faltered for a moment, she pushed herself forward. Marcus could see the determination in her eyes. Despite the exhaustion, the pain from her wounds, she was not giving up. He didn't expect her to, but it still impressed him. In the midst of chaos, he found himself relying on her as much as she was relying on him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more. The connection they had forged in these brief moments of crisis was undeniable. But there was no time to dwell on it. The only thing that mattered now was getting across the bridge and to the resistance zone on the other side. Sorethians weren't far behind them, and Marcus knew they couldn't outrun them, not for long. They had to make a stand soon or be overrun. The sound of gunfire echoed across the bridge. As the first wave of Sorethians reached the far side, Marcus turned and saw the lead soldier raise a weapon in their direction. Without thinking, he pulled the woman to the ground behind a support beam. The shot missed, but more came after it. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a full assault. They were under fire and pinned down on the bridge with no clear way out. The woman's face was pale, but she gritted her teeth and glanced at him, her eyes wide but resolute. She wasn't just scared, she was calculating, and she was planning her next move. Marcus could tell, but he didn't have time to ask her what she had in mind. As another barrage of gunfire rang out, he pushed her back further into the shadows of the bridge's understructure and drew his sidearm, keeping his head low as he returned fire. The crack of his pistol was sharp and quick, taking down the first few soldiers in his line of sight. But it wasn't enough. More kept coming from both ends of the bridge, and Marcus knew they couldn't hold out like this for long. He motioned for the woman to stay down as he surveyed the area, looking for any possible escape route. There were too many Sorethians closing in, and no place to hide. He needed a plan, a way to fight their way out without getting caught in the crossfire. But with each passing second, the odds seemed to slip further out of reach, and then something unexpected happened. The woman moved her hand to her side, pulling out a strange metallic device from a hidden pocket in her torn clothing. It was an alien artifact that Marcus didn't recognize, but the moment she pressed a button on its surface, the device hummed to life with a low vibrating pulse. The ground beneath them trembled, and the bridge seemed to shift for a moment. Marcus's eyes widened as he realized what she was doing. She was activating something he couldn't explain, but he didn't have time to ask questions as the bridge began to glow with a strange energy that Corinthians seemed to notice too. But it was too late. They were already caught in the pulse. As the bridge seemed to flicker and shift under them, Marcus could only brace himself as the unexpected happened. The pulse from the device surged through the air in a wave of blue light, and for a split second everything seemed to freeze. The Azarathians on the far side of the bridge stopped in their tracks, looking around in confusion as the ground vibrated beneath them. Marcus could feel the energy humming through his bones. And as the woman pressed the device harder, the glow intensified for a moment. He thought the bridge itself might collapse, but instead, the strange energy seemed to manipulate the very structure around them. It was as if the bridge was being reformed or shifted by some unseen force. Marcus barely had time to process what was happening when the first Sorathian soldier tried to take a step forward. The bridge rippled, and a jagged metal spire shot up from the center of the structure, piercing through the soldier's chest and sending him plummeting into the depths below. Another soldier screamed and tried to fire, but the pulse from the device shot out in a sharp burst of energy, knocking him off balance and sending him careening over the edge. The woman's hands were shaking, but her face was calm as she adjusted the device, sending out another wave. The Xarethian soldiers scrambled back, trying to retreat from the strange attack, but they were too slow. The pulse was relentless, and for every soldier that tried to escape, another wave of energy hit them, sending them sprawling to the ground or throwing them into the air. Marcus had never seen anything like this. It was alien tech, unlike anything he had encountered, and it was clear the woman knew how to use it with deadly precision. As the bridge shifted and the last of the soldiers fell back into the smoke, Marcus pulled himself up from where he had taken cover. Still stunned by the chaotic display of power, he turned to the woman who was still holding the device, her face set with determination. But her body was trembling slightly, the strain of using the device clearly taking a toll on her. But she didn't show it. She didn't hesitate for a second. When she motioned for him to follow her, the glowing pulse from the device faded, and the bridge returned to its original unstable state. But the threat from the Xarethians was no longer looming. The path ahead was now clear. Marcus didn't waste a second. He grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her forward at a sprint. They had to keep moving. The explosion of energy had given them a temporary reprieve, but the Azarathians wouldn't be far behind. They reached the end of the bridge, and before them lay a dense forest of overgrown trees and vines. The terrain here was rough and wild, but it offered some hope of cover. Marcus knew they had to get to the resistance before the Azarathians regrouped. They had no time to stop for rest. Not now, not when they were so close. The woman stumbled for a second, but caught herself. Marcus didn't slow his pace. He could feel the urgency rising in his chest. They had come too far to fail now. As they reached the edge of the forest, he glanced back for a moment and saw the faint silhouette of more Xarethian soldiers emerging from the smoke behind them. They were still coming, but Marcus didn't plan to be caught again. Not this time. He turned his eyes forward and pressed on with everything he had left. They plunged into the dense forest with the sounds of the Xarethians' pursuit growing fainter behind them. But Marcus knew better than to think they were safe. The terrain was thick with trees and underbrush, making it harder for them to be seen, but also slowing them down. Every step through the twisted roots and thick vines was a battle. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of wet earth, but Marcus's mind was focused solely on one thing: getting to the resistance before they were found. The woman was still by his side, her pace steady, but he could see the strain in her eyes. She wasn't as strong as she had been moments before, but she kept pushing forward, her determination evident with every step. They moved through the trees in silence, only the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves breaking the quiet. The weight of the moment was palpable. They had just escaped certain death, And yet the danger wasn't over. Far from it. The sounds of movement in the distance told Marcus that the Xerethians were still searching, but they were behind for now. They had a small window to make it to the resistance. He pushed forward with renewed urgency, hoping they could make it before they were caught again. The forest was vast and filled with hidden dangers, but they didn't have time to worry about that. They just needed to get to safety and regroup. When they reached the edge of the forest, Marcus slowed his pace, peering through the trees toward the clearing ahead. There were signs of activity. Smoke rising from a distant campfire, the flicker of torchlight from between the trees. He motioned for the woman to stay close, and they moved toward the camp quietly, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. When they finally broke through the underbrush, they found the resistance camp. A small group of Zoran soldiers were gathered around a fire, some tending to weapons, others speaking in hushed voices. Marcus was about to approach when one of the soldiers spotted them. The look in his eyes was one of suspicion. But as soon as he saw the woman, the soldier's expression softened. He immediately moved forward, lowering his weapon and raising a hand to signal the others. The woman stepped forward with more confidence now, her posture straight, despite the wariness in her movements. The soldier bowed his head slightly and spoke quickly in a language Marcus didn't understand. But the woman responded with words of her own. The soldier's eyes flicked between them, and then he turned toward the fire, signaling the others to stand down. The resistance leader approached, then a tall Zoran with gray skin and piercing yellow eyes. She had the air of someone used to commanding others, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor. When she saw the woman, her eyes softened in recognition. She spoke with authority, but her voice was low and careful. The woman nodded once and glanced at Marcus, who was still trying to process what was going on. The leader turned her gaze to him, and Marcus could see the question in her eyes. The suspicion was clear, but she didn't voice it. Instead, she motioned for him to sit by the fire. Marcus hesitated for a moment before lowering himself to the ground. The woman sat beside him, her body still trembling slightly from the exertion. As the resistance soldiers resumed their tasks, the leader began speaking in a low tone. Marcus could tell they were discussing strategy, planning their next move. And when they looked at him, he understood they had no intention of letting him go just yet. But he wasn't worried, not anymore. He had done what he came for. He had saved the woman, he had brought her to safety, and he would see this through to the end, whatever that meant for him, and whatever role he played in the fight ahead. The camp was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the muted conversations around them. Marcus tried to focus on the moment, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman sitting beside him. Her presence was still a mystery. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her, something more than just a survivor of this war. But what was it? The resistance leader finished speaking and turned her gaze back to Marcus. Her eyes narrowed as if she were evaluating him, but she didn't speak immediately. The woman beside him seemed to sense the tension and looked at him, then back to the leader. She said something in a language Marcus couldn't understand, but the tone was softer than before. The leader nodded and motioned for Marcus to follow her. Without another word, Marcus stood up and followed the Zoran leader toward the edge of the camp. He glanced back at the woman, but she didn't look at him. Her attention was focused on the fire as the two walked in silence. Marcus felt the weight of the leader's gaze on him, like she was studying every part of him, every movement. They stopped near a cluster of tents. The leader turned to face him, her expression serious and wary. Now Marcus understood she was not only concerned for her people, but for this alien woman, and for himself, his role in this whole mess. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. The stakes were higher than that. The leader spoke slowly, but firmly in broken trade language. Marcus had learned enough to understand the important parts. "You must tell me who she is." The leader's voice was heavy with authority. Marcus hesitated for a moment, not sure how to answer. He didn't know who she was either, not really, but he had saved her, and that had to count for something. He glanced over his shoulder again. The woman was still by the fire, but now several of the other soldiers were watching her carefully. She was more than just an alien. She was someone important. Marcus could feel it in his gut. He turned back to the leader and spoke, his voice steady. "I don't know who she is. I just know she needed help, and I gave it." The leader studied him for a long moment, her eyes piercing through him before she spoke again, her tone less harsh. "I do not trust humans easily," she said, "and you are not the first to bring someone like her to our camp. but I trust your actions, not your words." Marcus looked into her eyes, searching for some kind of sign that he wasn't about to be thrown out into the wilderness. But all he saw was a hardened resolve. She wasn't letting anyone in easily, not even him. "Then why did you let me in?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The leader's lips twisted into something like a smile. She looked over her shoulder at the woman, and then back at Marcus. "Because she trusts you," she replied. The words were simple, but they hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus felt a knot in his stomach. The woman had trusted him enough to lead her here, to bring her to safety. But why had she trusted him? Why had she come to him for help? The leader turned and started walking back toward the camp. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Follow me. You will get your answer soon enough. But for now you rest." He didn't know what that meant, but he wasn't about to argue. As he followed her back to the fire, he glanced once more at the woman and saw that she was looking at him, now her eyes unreadable. He took a seat beside her again. This time he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a part of something larger than himself, something that was just beginning to reveal itself. The woman didn't speak as Marcus sat beside her. Her eyes were distant, but he could feel her awareness, like a presence next to him. She wasn't fully here, not yet. Something was still holding her back. Maybe it was the weight of what she had just survived, or maybe it was something deeper that Marcus didn't understand. But she was still here, and that meant something. He could tell the leader had been cautious. But that was to be expected. Marcus didn't take it personally. He had come to learn that in these kinds of situations, everyone had their guard up, especially when it came to a mysterious figure like the woman sitting next to him. And yet she had trusted him, and Marcus found himself more and more drawn to that trust. He couldn't explain why, but it was there like an invisible thread between them. After a few moments, the leader reappeared, standing tall and solid, as if she had never left. Her eyes scanned the camp before landing on them. She motioned for the woman to stand, and the two exchanged a few quiet words. Marcus couldn't catch them, but he could see the way the woman responded. It wasn't just fear or confusion anymore. There was something else there, something that made Marcus uneasy. The leader looked at Marcus and then gestured toward a tent behind her. "This way," she said, simply, without waiting for a response. Marcus stood slowly, not sure what to expect, as he followed the leader into the tent. The air inside was cool compared to the heat outside, and it smelled of herbs and wood. The flickering light of a nearby lantern cast long shadows against the walls. Inside the tent were more resistance fighters, sitting around a table covered in maps and old communication equipment. They all stopped talking and turned toward the leader and Marcus, with sharp eyes assessing him. For the first time, Marcus noticed the woman had not followed them in. The leader glanced back toward the entrance and then closed the flap of the tent carefully before turning back to face him. "You need to know the truth," she said, her voice now low and deliberate. Marcus could feel the weight of her words and the sudden shift in the air. The tension in the tent was thick. "The woman you brought here, she is not just anyone. She is of the Duraza people, the last of them." The resistance leader paused, allowing the words to sink in. Marcus stood frozen. The Duraza people, he had heard of them in passing, but only as a distant part of history, an ancient race with abilities that were now nothing more than stories. But the last of them, he found himself shaking his head in disbelief. "Why would she trust me?" Then he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The leader studied him closely. "The woman trusts you because of something you don't yet understand. She believes you will help her fulfill her purpose, a purpose much larger than any of us." She looked toward the entrance again, her face darkening. "But there is more to this than survival, Marcus. The stakes are much higher than you realize." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, the weight of the leader's words sinking in. If the woman was truly the last of her kind, then this was no longer just about one life. It was about the fate of an entire race and the future of a galaxy teetering on the edge of war. The leader stepped closer to him, her expression serious. "She is not here by accident, Marcus. She came to you for a reason. And that reason might change everything." He didn't know what to say, but he could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. It was too much to take in. All at once he took a deep breath and nodded, but he knew that whatever came next, it would change him forever. Marcus stood there in silence, trying to process what the leader had just said. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, as if the entire universe had shifted beneath him. The Duraza people, the last of them, and the woman sitting outside the tent was somehow tied to the fate of them all he felt a cold chill run down his spine, and for the first time since meeting her, he realized just how little he knew about the woman he had saved. She wasn't just a survivor of the war, she was the key to something much bigger than himself, much bigger than anything he had ever known. The leader watched him carefully, as if waiting for him to speak. But he didn't know what to say. What could he say in a situation like this? The whole idea felt impossible. And yet here he was caught in the middle of it. The leader sighed softly and shook her head. "It is difficult for you to understand," she said quietly, "but you will have to soon, because the war is not over, and the enemies we face will stop at nothing to find her." The urgency in her voice sent a shiver through Marcus. He didn't know who the enemies were or what they wanted with the woman, but he could feel the danger closing in on them. He had felt it when they crossed the bridge, and he felt it now as the weight of their mission pressed down on him. She motioned for him to sit across from her, and without hesitation he complied. The resistance fighters at the table had resumed their quiet discussions, but their eyes kept drifting toward him, as if trying to gauge whether he was truly ready for the truth, or if he could even handle it. The leader's voice dropped lower as she leaned in closer to Marcus. "The woman you saved is not just the last of her people. She carries within her the power to change everything, the power to turn the tide of this war and end it for good." Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what kind of power she could possess, but the way the leader spoke made it sound like it was something beyond anything he could imagine. If the wrong people got their hands on her, if the Exorathians or anyone else figured out what she could do, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. But the leader wasn't finished. She can manipulate energy like no one else. She can bend its shape, it control it. It's why she was hidden away for so long. She can be a weapon or a savior. But that choice is hers to make. The room went still, and for a moment, Marcus could only hear the faint rustling of the tent flaps in the wind outside. He glanced back toward the entrance, where the woman stood watching him, now her eyes calm but unreadable, the firelight flickering in the distance, casting strange shadows across her face. She had been so quiet since they arrived, but now he could see there was something in her expression, something that said she had known this moment was coming. She had known. This was why she had trusted him. He didn't know what it meant yet. But in that moment, Marcus realized the decision wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about choosing what to do with the power she carried, and whether he was ready to stand beside her when the time came. He looked back at the leader and nodded, his resolve strengthening. He was in this now, whatever it took. Marcus stood there in silence, trying to process what the leader had just said. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, as if the entire universe had shifted beneath him. The Duraza people, the last of them, and the woman sitting outside the tent, was somehow tied to the fate of them all. He felt a cold chill run down his spine, and for the first time since meeting her, he realized just how little he knew about the woman he had saved. She wasn't just a survivor of the war, she was the key to something much bigger than himself, much bigger than anything he had ever known. The leader watched him carefully, as if waiting for him to speak, but he didn't know what to say. What could he say in a situation like this? The whole idea felt impossible. And yet here he was caught in the middle of it. The leader sighed softly and shook her head. "It is difficult for you to understand," she said quietly, "but you will have to soon, because the war is not over, and the enemies we face will stop at nothing to find her." The urgency in her voice sent a shiver through Marcus. He didn't know who the enemies were or what they wanted with the woman, but he could feel the danger closing in on them. He had felt it when they crossed the bridge, and he felt it now as the weight of their mission pressed down on him. She motioned for him to sit across from her, and without hesitation he complied. The resistance fighters at the table had resumed their quiet discussions, but their eyes kept drifting toward him, as if trying to gauge whether he was truly ready for the truth, or if he could even handle it. The leader's voice dropped lower as she leaned in closer to Marcus. "The woman you saved is not just the last of her people. She carries within her the power to change everything, the power to turn the tide of this war and end it for good." Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what kind of power she could possess, but the way the leader spoke made it sound like it was something beyond anything he could imagine. If the wrong people got their hands on her, if the Exorathians or anyone else figured out what she could do, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. But the leader wasn't finished. She can manipulate energy like no one else. She can bend it, shape it, control it. It's why she was hidden away for so long. She can be a weapon or a savior. But that choice is hers to make. The room went still, and for a moment, Marcus could only hear the faint rustling of the tent flaps in the wind outside. He glanced back toward the entrance, where the woman stood watching him, now her eyes calm but unreadable, the firelight flickering in the distance, casting strange shadows across her face. She had been so quiet since they arrived, but now he could see there was something in her expression, something that said she had known this moment was coming. She had known. This was why she had trusted him. He didn't know what it meant yet. But in that moment, Marcus realized the decision wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about choosing what to do with the power she carried, and whether he was ready to stand beside her when the time came. He looked back at the leader and nodded, his resolve strengthening. He was in this now, whatever it took.